is a 2021 Audi RS6 Avant. It has around 600 horsepower. It costs about $140,000, and it is the ultimate fast wagon right now. This is my 1994 Audi RS2. It has around 300 horsepower. It cost about $120,000 back when it was new, adjusted for inflation, and it was the ultimate fast wagon 25 years ago. And today, I'm going to compare them. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my new online enthusiast car auction website for modern enthusiast cars. If you're looking to sell a modern, cool car, sell it with Cars and Bids. You will get the most money for your cool car. If you're looking to buy a cool car from the modern era, same deal, buy it with Cars and Bids. We have live auctions of cool cars happening all the time. Check it out at carsandbids.com. First, a little overview. This isn't just any RS6. This is the RS6 Avant Nogaro Blue Tribute Edition. Audi is only making 25 units of this to celebrate 25 years since this, the RS2, the original fast Audi wagon. Although, actually, this came out 27 years ago, but we're gonna let that slide. Either way, the point is the RS2 is the car that started the fast Audi wagon trend, and it looks great in Nogaro Blue, the color that came to define high-performance Audis in the 1990s and early 2000s. The RS6, meanwhile, is the latest fast Audi, and it still looks great in Nogaro Blue. Now, it's important to point out here that these cars aren't actually direct descendants. The RS2 was based on the Audi 80, which was Audi's smaller car at the time. The modern equivalent would actually be the RS4 Avant, not the RS6, but they certainly belong together. The RS2 was the ultimate Audi wagon of its day, the fast wagon icon of the 90s. Well, the RS6 is the ultimate Audi wagon of now, the fastest, craziest, most desirable Audi wagon today. And here they are together for the very first time in North America ever, actually. Now, I've already reviewed each of these cars separately, so I'm going to link those videos in the description below if you want a more comprehensive look at the RS2 or the RS6 individually. Today, I'm going to compare them. New versus old, fast versus, well, fast 25 years ago. I'm going to show you around the exterior, the interior, do a little walk-around comparison, and then I'm going to drive them back to back and let you know what I think. All right, I'm going to start the comparison between the RS2 and the RS6 from this angle, where you can see probably the first thing you notice is the size difference between these two vehicles. The RS6 looks absolutely massive when it's parked next to the old school RS2. And in fact, the RS6 is a full 17 inches longer than the RS2, a foot and a half longer. Although it is important to remember that in addition to all the time that has passed between these two cars being built, the RS2 was based on the smaller Audi model at the time, the A4 size car, whereas this is of course based on the A6 size car, so there was always going to be some size difference, but it is pretty substantial. And those differences are even clearer when you look more closely at various items. For instance, the RS2's wheels are almost the exact same size as the RS6's front brakes. The RS6 has 16.5-inch front brakes. The RS2 has 17-inch wheels, and when you look closely, you can see RS6 wheels absolutely massive by comparison to RS2 wheels, and so are the brakes underneath them. That is a major thing that has evolved over the last 25 years in car design. Giant wheels, giant brakes. The other big thing you can see when they're parked nose to nose like this is the difference in design and styling between now and 25 years ago. I love modern Audi RS cars because they're pretty restrained as performance cars go. You don't really know you're looking at something crazy or fast unless you kind of have some knowledge and you see some of the cool details in the RS6. But you want to talk restrained, the RS2 is so subtle. You would never have any idea that it's anything fast or cool or exciting unless you really knew. So even though modern Audi RS models seem restrained, they're actually very outlandish and bold when you compare them with the old stuff. But it's not just the subtlety of the RS2 that comes out when you compare the design differences between these two cars. These are also great examples of how car design has evolved over the last 25 years. The RS6 is so much more modern with its stylized lines and its sort of sloping roofline, and it looks cool and exciting and great by modern standards. The RS2 is so much boxier, so much straighter, so much less modern, frankly, and you can really see how car design has evolved. The RS2 has a more practical, simpler, boxy shape without any real character lines that define it. It was just a station wagon. The RS6 has a lot more definition, a lot more lines, a lot more muscle to it, with all of the modern design influences that it carries. Very different in 25 years. It's also interesting parking these two cars next to each other just to see the differences in individual design pieces over the years. For instance, look at the headlights. The RS6 headlights are this very distinctive shape sculpted into the body. The RS2 just has these rectangles that sat in the front. There was not much effort paid to them, although admittedly it also matches the body of the car because the RS2 is essentially a rectangle in itself. But seeing these next to each other and seeing how that has changed is a good example of the evolution of car design. And speaking of design differences on the outside of these cars, the front ends are very different too, as you can clearly see with them next to each other. The first thing you notice here is obviously the difference in grille size. The old school RS2 has this relatively tiny rectangular grille. It was pretty much all they needed to get air into the engine. The new car has this massive front grille designed to be more than just a grille, also a distinctive shape that you can use to identify Audi models. You can see here how big grilles have really gotten over the years. Of course, the difference in headlights is also very clearly visible here. Again, you got the rectangle in the RS2, very simple old school design, versus this new, modern, more designed, more stylized unit in the RS6. Very big differences here. Now, one thing that I find interesting as I see the cars next to each other, the RS2 actually looks a little bit higher in front than the RS6. I assume that's because of pedestrian safety regulations. When the RS2 was out, there were no pedestrian safety regulations. Pedestrians were on their own. The RS6, that's different now. You can't have such a flat up front hood, and that's fallen out of favor in terms of design anyway. So you can see the RS6's hood, despite being a larger vehicle in every way, actually looks a little bit smaller, a little bit less jutting out than the RS2s. Of course, once again, you can also see big differences in physical size here. The RS6 obviously a lot wider than the old RS2, and that becomes very clear the moment you have them next to each other in this setting too. Again, a much larger car, the new RS6, but that's no surprise. One other thing you notice when you have them next to each other looking at the front ends is some clear differences in technology already start to become apparent. For instance, the radar sensors in the front of the RS6, you have these big sensors here so that you can use radar cruise control, speed up, slow down. RS2 doesn't have any of that stuff. Radar in a car wasn't even a thought in someone's mind when the RS2 was being made, at least not in Audis. By the way, one other point I want to raise up front before I move on to the back is once again the styling and design changes over the years. The RS2, again, very simple, very boxy, not too many lines, and in the front, not too many creases or gouges, which is a direct contrast to the RS6, which is a lot more fussy, a lot more cuts and style lines in the grille, the front end. The RS6, of course, that's how modern cars are now, and the RS2 that's how cars were back then, and these two really emphasize those differences as well. And next up we move on to the rear comparison, RS2 versus RS6, and again, you can clearly see some major differences back here, and the first most noticeable one is, as always apparently, the size difference, although the height difference isn't as pronounced as it looks at first glance. The RS6 is taller than the RS2, but only by a couple of inches. It just looks a lot taller because it has higher ground clearance back here with the bumper and back, and they've moved the brake lights up substantially, which gives it sort of a taller, more imposing look back here, even though they're not that disparate. To me, the big difference in size comes in the width of these two cars. Once again, you can see just how much larger the RS6 is widthwise compared to the RS2, which really does look like a much smaller compact sport wagon, which is what it was at the time. Another discrepancy back here, a hilarious one, is the exhaust situation. The RS6 has these massive dual exhausts mounted under the bumper. They look so menacing and mean. The RS2 has this tiny little double tailpipe, very subtle and out of the way. It was not intended to look as muscular and aggressive, at least in terms of exhaust styling. And another difference back here, just like all the other exterior angles, is the design and styling. 25 years of design difference. The RS6 just looks more modern, more lines, more definition, more toned, with those brake lights, basically the whole look, versus the RS2 with this very 90s looking light bar in back. Very different looking cars in back, you can see, and this is probably where they look the most different, at least to me. They don't look related even in the slightest, even though they sort of are. Finally, when it comes to rear end differences between these two cars, nowhere is the technology different more apparent than the turn signals, which are on right now, and you can see the massive difference between these two cars. The RS2 with its old school halogen single bulb pathetically blinking, whereas the RS6 has this beautiful LED sweeps across the back, very bright, totally different lighting experience with the turn signals back here. I think this is amazing to look at. This is a great example of one of the many changes that has happened in the car world over the last 25 years, and especially in the Audi world, as they've gone all in on cool, crazy looking turn signals and taillights. You can tell they didn't care as much about that stuff 25 years ago. Next up, let's move inside RS2 and RS6 and let's talk interior. And I'm sitting in the RS2 and the interior is just not all that great. 90s was not the best era for car interiors. In the 50s and 60s, you had a lot of beautiful, cool stuff. In the 80s, you had a lot of electronic stuff and weird experimentation. The 90s, it was just boring, not great materials by modern standards, and the RS2 suffers from that as well. You can see in the center control stack, it's all rectangles in here to just get everything into its place. There's not much thought paid to like cohesive design or making it look cool. It was just functional, which is fine, but by modern standards, not really all that beautiful or nice. Compare that to the center stack in the RS6, which is amazing. Not only do you have all these screens, of course, but you have lines coming in from everywhere. It's not just rectangles stuck there to look simple and work properly. A lot more effort was paid to make sure everything looked good and beautiful and cool in the RS6, and frankly in all modern cars compared to almost all 90s cars. And the interior differences are clear everywhere you look in these two cars. These two interiors are probably the places where these two cars are the most separate. More than exterior engine performance, the interiors look like they are cars from two different planets. It is a totally different thing, and you can see how much older the RS2 interior looks compared to the RS6. And size is a big difference too, just like the physical size on the outside that I've been showing you. In here, very different. RS6 has a lot more space for passengers and for stuff basically everywhere. One good place where you can see that is in the center console. In the RS6, you have all these buttons, silver trim, this weird gear shifter, this large center console storage area. In the RS2, this is what you get. 6 inches wide, mostly plastic, tiny cup holders, and that is it. The RS6 is far more advanced, obviously in technology, but even just in center console design and size in this interior. But probably the craziest interior difference between these two cars would be in the gauge cluster. RS2 gauge cluster, very simple, straightforward gauges, just like you'd expect from cars from this era. It doesn't look bad at all, it looks fairly normal. And there are 3 little screens in here. The one on the top in the center lets you know, like if you're listening to a tape or the radio station, or if there's a warning. The one right below that gives you a few pieces of car information, like how many miles you have until you run out of fuel. And then there's also a clock in here. Very simple, very easy gauge cluster like you'd expect. This is the RS6's gauge cluster. It is a totally different world, the absolute future compared to this RS2. And if you had seen the RS6's gauge cluster back when the RS2 was a new car, you would think the RS6 was coming from 100 years in the future, not just 25. Totally different, full screen, totally configurable. Google Maps is right below your sightline while you're driving. It is an unbelievable difference compared to the old school cluster in the RS2. And there are some pretty substantial interior differences between these two cars in the back seat too. You'll notice I've expertly chosen to sit in the RS6's back seat because the RS2's is so small. You'll know what I'm talking about if you've seen my RS2 announcement video from a few weeks ago. But anyway, back here, RS6 has a lot of different things for the rear seat passengers. You have rear seat climate control with this little screen. You have rear heated seats. You have 3 different power ports, 2 USB-C and 1 cigarette lighter style. You even have built-in screens in the back windows that you can put up to keep the the sun out of your eyes if you're sitting in the back, or out of your baby's eyes if you're transporting an infant. The RS2 has pretty much none of that stuff. A very simple, very basic, very bare bones back seat. You were just supposed to sit back there and be quiet while Dad drove you along in Germany at 190 kilometers per hour on the Autobahn. And of course, again, very much smaller, just like basically everything else in the RS2. It's like a shrunken down version of the RS6, and that is tremendously apparent in the back seat. You just don't have all that much room to actually sit back there. It was just how cars were back then, but especially smaller cars like the RS2. And since we're talking interior, and since these are wagons with practicality as one of their main purposes, we gotta talk cargo area, where you will see some big differences just like everywhere else. Start with the RS6. To open it, you tap the key fob and it automatically glides open, very luxurious. And you can see quite a large cargo area in here, a lot of space, bigger than the RS2's, no surprise, owing to the RS6's overall larger size. You also have some nice modern conveniences back here, including these little latches on the side where you can fold the seats down. You pull them and the back seats fold down to make it easier to load large items. You also have a power outlet back here. Otherwise, nothing too special, but very nice, very large, a good cargo area. The RS2, on the other hand, in order to get back here, of course, there's no power option. You have to open it up yourself. And when you do that, you discover not quite as many modern conveniences as the RS6. You don't have any seat folders back here. You don't have any power outlet back here, but you still have a nice cargo area, and you have cargo tie-downs, which are a nice little touch. It is worth noting the rear seats do fold in the RS2, but you have to go to each individual seat to fold them down. Now, I will say one benefit of the RS2 is the load floor is lower. Because the car is physically smaller, everything is lower, tinier. The load floor is a lot lower than in the RS6, which makes it a little bit easier to get stuff into the back. When you lift it up, you don't quite have to lift it as high. That's a slight RS2 advantage when it comes to the cargo area. Otherwise, all of the advantages are for the RS6. And finally, we move under the hood, which is kind of interesting because these two Audis share more than just the fact that they are both blue, iconic Audi high-performance wagons. They also have Porsche engines. To an extent, anyway. The RS2 has the old 2.22 turbo 5-cylinder, which was an Audi engine, but it was heavily improved and upgraded by Porsche in many different ways, so much so that it actually says powered by Porsche on the engine itself. After all, the RS2 was built by Porsche, and it was also powered by Porsche. And that's also true of the RS6. Like many high-performance Volkswagen Group products, this uses the 4-liter twin-turbo V8, which is also in the Audi RS-Q8, the Lamborghini Urus, the Bentley Bentayga, and the Porsche Cayenne Turbo, the Porsche Panamera Turbo. And this engine was originally developed by Porsche and then farmed out to the other Volkswagen Group brands. So these are two fast Audi wagons, both of which carry Porsche engines. There's more of a connection here than you realize. Now, of course, the amazing thing is when the RS2 was built, Porsche and Audi were totally separate companies, had no intent of ever getting together, and then things changed over the years. Globalization happened, and corporate takeover happened, and cost sharing happened, and that's the reason for this happenstance of two Porsche-engined Audis, but that's what we have. However, that is, of course, where the similarities end. RS2 turbo 5-cylinder with about 310 horsepower, RS6 turbo V8 with about 600 horsepower. The RS6's engine is about double the size and double the power of the RS2's, not quite, but really close. It's a much bigger, faster, more powerful car. Interestingly, 0 to 60 time is not as different as you might think. RS2, 4.8 seconds 0 to 60. RS6 is about 3.6, 3.7 seconds. That's a lot when you're getting under 5 seconds. Each tenth of a second is a big deal, but they're not that different considering the massive power, performance, and age differences between the two cars. And of course, both of these cars have all-wheel drive, Audi's famous Quattro system. You couldn't get a fast Audi wagon without it. The big question, though, is how different do they feel? How do they drive? What's the difference there? So let's find out. I'm now going to drive the RS2 and the RS6 back to back and see what 25 years has done for driving experience. All right, I'm going to start out in the RS2, and I have to say, relative to the RS6, this car drives old. To be clear, it doesn't drive slow. If you gear down and really get into the throttle, this can be a lot of fun to drive. It really can. When the turbo kicks in, this is a seriously fast car, and I actually wouldn't be entirely stunned if it's about as quick as the RS6 from 40 to 60 in terms of RPM, 40 to 70. The problem is really on the low end where it feels like an old school turbo car. Now I kind of like that. I like a car that starts off slow and then slams you back in your seat. It's kind of a cool feel, but it really does do that. And it's very different from a modern car, which has more linear power delivery. But beyond just like the way that it feels as a performance car and how fast it is, it feels like an old car in here. Stuff creaks, stuff rattles. The interior is just not all that nice, and it's hard to believe that people paid the equivalent of $120,000 for this type of car back then. Now, one big benefit of the RS2, of course, is it has 3 pedals and a manual transmission. And I think that's one of the reasons that I really enjoy driving it. And if I had the 2 cars sitting in my garage, as I have for the last few days, I would probably walk up to the RS2 if I wanted to go for a fun evening, drive just by myself on some nice roads. It's not as fast, it's not as sporty, but it's more involved with 3 pedals with a manual. It's more fun, frankly. And you can really push the car to its limits without doing anything too crazy. So many modern cars, you accelerate even a little bit and you're way over the speed limit. Not so in the RS2. You can go through the gears and it's a lot of fun. And then, you're still relatively legal. And I do want to make it clear, when you're driving it, this car is pretty fun to drive. It's got a pokey little engine. It's surprisingly quick in terms of steering and handling. There is understeer because the engine is way out over the front axles, which is kind of an old school way to do it. But otherwise, this is a pretty fun and exciting little car. And back in the day, I could easily see, having driven other cars in this period, I could easily see how this would have felt like a total monster from back then. The RS2 is also surprisingly smooth and surprisingly nice to drive. It's too bad for the poor RS2 that 25 years later we're comparing it to its newest version, because it's just worse. But on an objective level, this is a damn good car, especially when you compare it to other vehicles from this era. This thing was fantastic, and you can see why it's developed such a great following and why it was so popular in the time, why it was such a cool car back then. It is interesting sitting in here though. You have great visibility, you have a lot of glass everywhere. Not quite the case in the RS6. Windows have gotten smaller even as cars have gotten bigger, but electronic aids kind of make up for it. You also don't have that much space in here, but everything in this car is just so honest. There's nothing superfluous in this car, nothing unnecessary. Everything in here is functional and simple and right where it ought to be, and that's how it was done. It wasn't designed for beauty or for showing off. It was very purposeful, like a lot of German cars, and frankly all cars were from this era. I do like rolling through the gears in this car. I just find it to be fun. It's rewarding, slotting it into each gear. I like the mechanical feel of this car. I like how the steering wheel is hydraulic, the steering. It's a very potent, easy engine to get revved up, to rev match. Everything in this car, very straightforward, very simple, and there are some great benefits to that. You want to go out on a mountain drive or whatever, you take this car, you don't want to be paying attention to a million screens. This car is great for that, and it's just such an icon, and it's very cool. Very special car to drive, even though it does feel its age. All right, now switching into the RS6, and this is interesting. The first thing you notice, at least the first thing I notice when I get in here immediately, is the increase in precision. The handling and steering precision is unbelievable. Just immediacy when you turn the steering wheel compared to the RS2. Now that's interesting because this is a much bigger car. So you would think that precision maybe would go to the smaller car, but that's just not true. The newness factor outweighs the smallness factor of the RS2, and they've just done so many wonders more with precision over the years. And so this car, not the RS2, feels a little bit more precise, a little bit more immediate in its steering response. And of course, that is also true in its power delivery. This car is unreal when it comes to performance. I think Audi says 0 to 60 in 3.5, 3.6, 7, something like that. And boy, does it feel it. It is really, really quick. Let's see if I can open it up here. You're just slammed back in your seat. I mean, it's incredible how quick it is considering its size. One thing I like is it just grips and goes. It like squats down and it's like, all right, well, I'm ready, let's do this. And it does it. Just excessive acceleration. Whew. so fast. I mean, really insane. Interestingly, not that much noise to this car, similar to the RS2 in that respect. Certainly could have more of an exhaust note, like the AMG wagon. It definitely is more muted than that. Now, one thing I will say, one interesting advantage I'll give the RS2 too, in fact, but one that I was surprised by is this car does feel its weight. The steering precision is excellent, but when you're handling, when you're really going through a corner and you're feeling how the car responds to the changes in the road, this car is heavy. I mean, it's big and it's heavy, and you can tell that pretty quickly. Now, Audi does a lot to counteract that. This car has rear wheel steering, this car has all-wheel drive, and it's got a very powerful engine, very precise steering, but at the end of the day, it is still a large car, and that's an interesting advantage to the RS2. I took the RS2 on a really nice canyon, like mountain run, a couple hours, and it feels very tossable, very nimble, hydraulic steering, and it's a small car. It understeers, it's not as precise to steer, but when you throw it around a corner, you have not necessarily more confidence, but it's just a smaller vehicle that isn't rotating as much, and you feel just like you can kind of chuck it around a little bit more without worrying that, you know, it's a big car, something's gonna happen. The RS2 just feels a little bit more tossable, which is something that I like. Now, the other obvious benefit of the RS2 is you get 3 pedals. This car, probably 3 pedals would be stupid because it's so fast that you wouldn't be able to shift quite quickly enough. And it's just a big car, and roll your gears in a car this size, it doesn't really make sense. But there's something missing from an automatic transmission performance car. There just is. It just doesn't quite feel the same. And I think, having driven now both of these cars back to back, the conclusion I'm starting to reach is this car would be amazing for daily driving capability. It's really fast, it's really fun, it's got great tech, it's so smooth, much bigger on the inside. But if I was to pick something for the weekend, and I mentioned this when I was driving the RS2, I would probably still take the RS2. It's not as fast, it's not as precise, but it's more tossable. You can use the whole car, you can gear up, gear down, shift gears like you want, and I think that just makes it not faster, but more fun in my book. This is sort of the ultimate daily driver Audi wagon, no question. And the RS2 maybe feels like the ultimate throw it around, have fun with it on back roads Audi wagon. This thing, with its size, with its automatic transmission, it's not really a backroad car, and it's almost too effortless. You don't really have as much fun in this car. And so that's a look at new versus old, the best, fastest, latest Audi wagon versus the one that started it all. Truthfully, I have a hard time picking between these two cars. I love the RS2 as a fun backroads driver with a manual transmission, but the RS6 is amazing. Unbelievable performance, technology, power, comfort. It would be an ideal daily driver. The perfect situation would be to have both, because then you would truly have it all in the form of 2 bright blue Audi wagons.